Hello, everyone. The seventh winter school program, thanks to the participation of prominent and emerging political scientists, historians, sociologists, and other scholars from different parts of the world and different backgrounds, offered, in fact, a timely, rich, and a much-needed discussion. Taken together, the papers discussed and the lecture presented during the past 6 days have broadly agreed that the world is experiencing, in fact, a post-liberal moment, although often the scholars avoided treating it as a uniform, irreversible, or fully consolidated rupture with liberalism. So, post-liberalism has been framed less as a simple end of the liberal order than as a period of crisis, erosion, and reconfiguration driven by the contradictions of liberal democracy, liberal globalism, the liberal international order itself, and many other factors. So this roundtable will attempt to broaden the discussion by reflecting on whether we are witnessing post-liberal international governance. Yes, post-liberal international governance, another slippery concept that scholars have traditionally associated with governments, with formal multilateral cooperation among sovereign states centered on institutions such as the United Nations. However, this government-centric or state-centric understanding has increasingly been challenged as insufficient to capture the diversity of non-state actors, mechanisms, and practices that characterize contemporary global international relations. So liberal international governance is increasingly refers to institutionalized systems of rules, norms, laws, and practices in international relations, shaped mostly by liberal principles and carried out by a mix of states, non-state actors, international organizations, and other public and private actors operating across the borders. Now, this roundtable will reflect on a number of questions related to this complex issue, including these are some of the questions that will come up. What and who is driving change within the framework of liberal international governance? Will this system remain liberal? Will it be resilient? Or will it erode and be replaced by a different order? If we are moving forward to a post-liberal order, who will be the major actors? Established powers, coalitions from the global south, non-state actors, or other new actors? Finally, are we moving towards a stable or hybrid order, combining old and new institutions, laws, rules, and actors, or towards fragmentation, disorder, and a renewed dominance of power politics? So to help us broaden the discussion, we are privileged to be joined by a diverse panel of experts who have agreed to speak in an alphabetical order. Let me briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So we'll start, the discussion will start with Amanda Garrett. She's Assistant Professor of Comparative and International Politics at Georgetown University in Qatar. Harith Hasan, Associate Professor at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Lynda Iroulo, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Georgetown University in Qatar also. Marlene Laruelle, a professor at Luis Guido Carli University in Rome and director of the Illiberalism Studies program based in Washington, D.C. and Paris. And last speaker, but not the least, will be Dr. Adham Saouli, Professor of Politics and International Relations and head of the Critical Security Studies program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. So the approximately 90-minute debate will be structured as follows. First round, each participant will have up to 10 minutes to offer his or her perspective on post-liberal international governance. Then we'll move to a second round, where participants will have between 3 to 5 minutes to engage directly with one another's remarks. And final round, we'll open the floor to the audience. We'll take questions and comments from the audience will be taken by participants who will have the opportunity to respond to these questions from the audience and engage with their comments. So let's start. Amanda, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. Thank you to the Doha Institute for having me here. So my background is in international migration. I'm a migration scholar, so I'm going to answer some of these questions and discuss this idea of a post-liberal paradigm shift through the lens of international migration. And actually, I think this is a really useful lens within which to answer some of these questions about whether we're still in this liberal international order or whether we're shifting either into it or and how long we're going to stay there. So I think it's a particularly useful lens through which to look at these questions. Just a bit of a spoiler alert, I think with respect to how states sort of engage with the international order, how much they participate in it, what their contribution is, and how they choose to make policies at home, I would say we're in a post-liberal moment. There are features of post-liberalism for sure, undeniably, within this set of policy frameworks. But I want to sort of argue that this isn't so much a shift as it is sort of the way things have always been done with respect to international migration. So, and I'll explain a little bit why I've come down on that side of the table. When it comes to international migration, the concept of state sovereignty and national security and national interest have always been important. States always have wanted to control who comes and on what terms they come. And so the idea with the international order and participating in the liberal international order is that they would constrain states' tendencies in some way to act differently. And so within the international migration realm, what you might see, of course, is the proliferation of multinational institutions, the propensity for international cooperation on the dimension of migration, and potentially this would also mean opening up borders, or at least being more open to the idea of moving freely across borders, the protection of individual rights and liberties and human rights in particular, and human dignities. And so the idea is that the international order would sort of incentivize behavior in this way. And it might happen that this this happens essentially organically. So similar to the way neoclassical economists think that we engage in the international order and it sort of benefits everyone, especially if we're trading and engaging according to our comparative advantage, states are going to engage in this kind of win-win relationship. Some have argued the same should be true of the flow of people, that if I have a surplus of labor and you have a dearth of labor, the more we sort of engage in this trade of people, the better off both of us are going to be. For those a little bit less pessimistic, or a little bit more pessimistic, I'm sorry about the prospects of that happening organically, the international order is going to constrain states' proclivities to close off borders or to restrict human rights. They're going to incentivize people to engage in the international act of cooperation. But when it comes to international migration, the reality is that states have really struggled to be part of this liberal order. The relationship has always been one that is relatively difficult, and arguably has had always a relationship with post-liberalism even before that was a term we talked about. And the reason for this primarily is that international cooperation with respect to migration is a really difficult sell for states. People are different from other types of policy arenas that we might engage in, different from trade, different from capital, different from non-proliferation, different from conflict resolution. It's much less sometimes a situation of win-win, it's less reciprocal. This is why, in fact, we see many fewer international organizations devoted to cooperation on the issue of migration. We see some bilateral organizations that exist. We see regional ones. The European Union Schengen Zone is one really good example of an enduring and quite powerful effort to cooperate with respect to the movement of people. But at the international level, we don't have really all that much. We have the 1951 Convention on Refugees. So this is probably the most important and the most well-respected, well-revered of all of the possible institutions at the national, at the international level, but that's also not saying much. This institution itself has had a lot of problems and lacks a lot of compliance mechanisms to go along with it. So there isn't a lot at the international level that actually encourages states to cooperate with each other. And states don't have much of an incentive to engage in this international cooperation. If states want migration, they can act unilaterally to make that happen. They can act without the cooperation of any other states. They can change their domestic policies. They can increase prices, increase wages, up recruitment. They can change what's happening domestically to incentivize migration without ever having to cooperate with any other state. They can do this. International migration is not unique in this sense either, but it's definitely a very significant hurdle to international cooperation and migration is the fact that you have a massive collective action problem. The world might be better off if every state, every country cooperated when it came to the movement of people, but the reality is there are lots of states that simply act as free riders. They don't have much of an incentive to contribute. They're happy to let the bigger and richer states do most of the heavy lifting. They're happy to opt out quietly. And the big states maybe don't have as much of an incentive to keep participating if so many people are free riding. We saw a really good example of this in 2016 and 2017 in the context of Europe with the Dublin Convention. This is a law that collectively would have bound all of the European nations to essentially accept asylum seekers in the first country that they set foot on in the European Union. And what ended up happening for the poor countries on the periphery, on the borders of Europe, is that they ended up bearing the brunt of most of this migration, and the rest of the countries in the middle of Europe and continental Europe basically said, tough luck. The Dublin Convention says you have to keep taking these migrants. So the countries on the periphery said, well, we'll subvert the system in other ways. We'll send them through the borders. We'll turn our attention in other ways, and the system eventually ended up collapsing completely. Right? Because there was simply no buy-in and no real incentive for these states to cooperate with each other. Another major problem is, of course, that humans come with different types of costs, right? There's long-term consequences to having migrants in your country, political, economic, social, cultural. And so you really need the buy-in of the population through a vote or through some other legislative mechanism to make sure that migrants are accepted, right? And just to give you one sort of more historical example, although it certainly rings true today in the context of the United States, the U.S. has always been sort of bifurcated in terms of its preferences for migration. Some demographics really want migration, others really don't. Unfortunately, the sort of the liberal left, the traditional camp of the pro-immigrants, aren't very well organized or very good at lobbying, or at least not as good at lobbying as those who are on the pro-immigration side in the business sector. And so it's actually the businesses and big agriculture and big business that have been most effective at lobbying for pro-immigrant policies in the United States. And so domestic politics have been much more important in guiding states in terms of their proclivities towards the liberal international order, even though it has nothing, in fact, to do with buy-in from, into the liberal international system. So when it comes to international migration, states have always done what they want. They've always done what's in their best interest. They're constrained only at the margins in terms of their activities and engagement with the international community. I don't think this has shifted tremendously from what we see today. We have mass deportations, we have revocations of citizenship, especially in places like Kuwait. More recently, we have the increase in populism in terms of political parties and also nativist rhetoric. We have the increase in guest worker programs. We see all of this happening now. We've seen it all happen before. The one thing that maybe indicates a real shift in the post-liberal direction, I think, that is potentially more worrying, is a change in the rhetoric around the humanization of migrants. The liberal international order, grants migrants some legitimacy to exist, to be non-disposable in the place in which they are, the sort of idea of protecting human dignity, if you will. And I think we have, in fact, seen a shift in the rhetoric surrounding this recently. The dehumanization of the migrant is something that's definitely on the increase. But just to sum up really quickly, I don't think with respect to migration specifically we're seeing much of a shift from a liberal international order to a post-liberal international order. I think we've sort of always been in the post-liberal space in practice, unfortunately. So, thank you.
Thank you, Aicha. So the first question that came to my mind when I read your questions is, what is the liberal international order? And my understanding of it is that it's a set of institutions, alliances, and rules shaped over nearly a century by U.S. hegemony. And therefore, we could call it a liberal order, but we also can call it Pax Americana as well. And this is important because my argument here is that what is happening today is not that there is an outside power trying to challenge strongly U.S. hegemony, a power that wants to alter the balance of power globally. What is happening is that the very hegemon within this system, the United States, is losing faith in the liberal international order. It turns itself from being the keeper of the order into a revisionist power, using the language of IR. So when the hegemon becomes revisionist, of course the whole order becomes destabilized. Even the idea that it is because of the rise of China, in my understanding, China rose not because the order wanted to exclude it, but because the order sought to integrate China within the global economy. And this is how China managed to grow and to take advantage and to benefit from the international political and economic institutions. So the point also that I want to make here is the future of the international order today largely depends on how far the United States is willing to go in changing the rules of the game, and on the extent to which other actors, China, Europe, Russia, are prepared to adapt to these changes without undertaking major shifts in their own policies. I mean, it seems to me that some of the forces that are influencing Trump administration, Trump's associates, for example, some major corporations, high-tech sector, far-right ideologues, Israel, are operating with a strong sense of urgency. There is a clear effort to make these transformations as deep, rapid, and difficult to reverse as possible, particularly in their impact on institutions, norms, and modes of governance. Yet this, in my view, remains an open question, given the contradictions among these forces that shape Trump's administration's policies, as well as Trump's own volatile personality. But never in my life I remember the world in a situation so much reliant on U.S. internal politics. The change that could happen after Trump, who's coming after Trump, will MAGA disintegrate, will the Democratic Party will come with a better candidate? All these questions always influenced international politics, but not to the extent that we see today. Another point I want to bring to the discussion is regarding the Global South, and the Middle East is part of it. Today we are witnessing an expansion of organized violence worldwide, especially in the Global South. There are more than 61 active armed conflicts, the highest number since the Second World War. It is not simply a matter of more wars, but of a changing character of conflict, a greater involvement of non-state actors. Conflicts are moving to the urban centers. Technology like drones are helping this move. An increasing civilian exposure to violence. The second point I want to make about the Global South is that we see also the decline of international aid. We know that Western countries, especially the United States, Europe, always mitigated difficult economic situations and conflicts in the Global South through aid. But with the dismantling of USAID and the decline of European donations to the Global South, there is a space left and nobody's filling it. Some people saying China is trying, but that's not enough. And this might cause further tensions in the Global South. The governments are unable to deliver services to secure their own populations, and which leads to further tensions. And we already saw indicators of that in the recent wave of protests in South Asia, in Morocco, and other places. And I expect this will continue in the upcoming years. Then there is the technological change. The global economy is undergoing a profound technological transformation driven by AI, robotics, and automation. Unlike earlier phases of globalization, this shift threatens to displace millions of unskilled and semi-skilled workers, especially in labor-intensive sectors that once absorbed surplus labor in developing economies. At the same time, technological change is asymmetric. While jobs disappear, states allied with major tech firms gain access to unprecedented tools of surveillance, data extraction, and social control. So just think about this. Elon Musk is willing to deploy Starlink for Iranian protesters, but he never accepted to do this for people of Gaza. So people such as Elon Musk are now global actors, not only influencing a global economy, they are influencing global politics, even in the European countries, even in a country like the United Kingdom. These structural pressures are already generating new waves of protest across the Global South, as I mentioned. Rising prices, unemployment, corruption, but also by deeper frustrations over blocked mobility and declining prospects. Importantly, these protests do not necessarily articulate clear ideological alternatives. Rather, they express a crisis of expectations, where society sense that existing economic and political arrangements no longer deliver basic security or dignity. So the last point I want to make, I think meaningful change here remain very difficult. The global economy systematically places the Global South in inferior bargaining position through debt dependence, unequal trade relations, technological monopolies, and financial difficulties that these countries are facing. Even when governments seek reform, they operate within tight external constraints that limit policy autonomy. As a result, a protest often leads to repression, co-optation, or cosmetic reform rather than structural transformation, further eroding trust between the state and societies.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Hi. Thank you for the invitation. And yeah, thank you for a chance to speak on the liberal international order. Why do I just wanted to start with the fact that, we have Pan-Africanists on the table, and this is true a true Pan-Africanism. If we can sit together, regardless of the fact that Morocco defeated Nigeria yesterday. But yeah, like we move on.
Fair play.
Yeah.
Fair play.
So I'm going to be speaking about the liberal international order from the perspective of international organizations and specifically African regionalism. I'm a scholar of international relations, so I'm going to look at it from multilateral institutions and the evolution of it over time. And I'd like to start this conversation with, when I read your prompts, I remember I was at the ISA in Chicago last year. And while heading to a panel, I met a group of my professors from PhD days, and I haven't seen them in years. So, I walked up and I said hi. And, they were asking, like, how are you doing? How is Qatar? Is it treating you well? Do you feel comfortable there? I was like, I feel amazing. And then my supervisor, who was, part of the group, said, it's such a pity that the state of the world is this way. With Trump in government, multilateral institutions are in decline. Lynda, is so unfortunate. Like you're young, so it seems like you're seeing too much of the decline of multilateral institutions. There used to be glory days, and I was like, wow, really? I know I'm young, but I asked myself, like, when was the glory days of liberal international order? The answer that I gave myself was like, okay, liberal international order is definitely in the eyes of the beholder. Because if you're looking at, regionalism from the perspective of Europe, it's a different narrative if you look at, the liberal international order. If you look at it from the perspective of CARICOM community, it's a different perspective. If you look at it from African regionalism, is a totally different perspective. So first of all, what is, liberal international order? Hasan has started us off with, the definition. And from an international organization's perspective, we look at it as, the times of rulemaking and norm-making and the increase of multilateral institutions. We tend to look at it from, the beginnings of the League of Nations to the United Nations and all the other institutions that came after that. And then the question becomes, has there always been liberal international order? And I'm sure we've been reflecting on this throughout, the week that we've had, having these conversations. And if I think about the liberal international order from the perspective of African regionalism, I would argue, first of all, that it's always been provincial. Post-independence African nations got independence and came into the space of multilateral institutions. They used it to the extent that they could, but they also knew that they couldn't depend on this. And the fact that, there were so many other things happening on the continent that gave the fact that global institutions could not be depended on. So while, the United Nations was talking about self-determination, and sovereignty, so many assassinations were happening on the continent. If you think about Patrice Lumumba in 1961 of, DRC Congo, Amilcar Cabral, Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, Eduardo Mondlane, Samora Machel, Mozambique. And this is just scratching the surface of assassinations that happened at a time where we were heralding multilateral institutions, self-determination, sovereignty, and human rights, and all of that. So has liberal international order, is there a shift? Is there an erosion? I would argue that that is not even, it's always been eroding, I would say. And it's always been shifting. It's always been provincial. Because while these institutions were being created, Global South institutions were being created. If we look at the non-aligned movement in 1961, and then, following that, the All African People's Congress that happened on the continent post-independence that led to the Organization of African Unity, and then subsequently the African Union, and how we have all these recs now on the continent looking at issues of good governance, development. The liberal international order has always been in the province. It's never been universal, first of all, and it's never been at the center. It's always been one of the many other orders that have been existing since the 20th century. So the reality is that, yes, we've had multiple orders over time. We've had multiple orders based on the sorts of multilateral institutions that were created to solve different problems. Beyond the African Union, the Association of Southeastern Nations, the CARICOM community, we have Mercosur. So all of these interactions have been happening alongside the liberal international order. And if we go beyond that and look at the works of John Hobson when it comes to globalization, even before the 19th century, we would see that there's always been regionalism and interactions within and among the global South, even before the interaction with Europeans. So, I think it's important for us to, and we've been made to think, at least for me as an international relations scholar who has been at the center of European discourse on liberal international order, there is a sense of making it appear that it's been universal, it's been at the center, but no, it's been one of the many orders that we've had post-1945. And what are the new ways that this order is possibly shifting or, evolving? I would argue that, these orders have been ongoing. These interactions have been happening. We just see a reformalization of it. If we look at the Sahel, for instance, there is a new order happening there with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. We see an intensification of interactions that have always been there of Russia and China. And I think this is something that, at least from my conversations from African Union bureaucrats, this is something that they embrace because there has been a dominance of, Western, and by Western I mean European, powers and the U.S. and the funding of African Union programs. So the fact that you have an intensification of, China's, interaction with Africa and Russia's interaction makes them feel like there is a lot more, space to kind of like bargain with different powers. So it's a different space, it's a welcoming space according to these African Union bureaucrats. So like I said, I also want to, emphasize again that the question is not whether the international, liberal order, is in erosion or is shifting. It's always been provincial. It's always been happening amidst many other orders being created. The question is, would it finally recognize that it's never been universal and always been provincial? And what we see is not a crisis of, and I'm saying this from an international institutions perspective, not just a crisis of order, but possibly a crisis of opportunity. That we see the shifting of alliances, we see an intensification of global South interactions through the BRICS, and I hope that we, continue to see more of that happening. I'll stop there and look forward to our interactions later. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will continue the discussion by trying to make the claim that we are now moving, so that we don't see a collapse of the liberal international order, but a shift toward a more multi-normative environment. And that this multi-normativity can be defined as a kind of thin post-liberalism, if you understand post-liberalism as a kind of multi-normativity where liberalism is only one of the possible order. I think we have three big kind of normative systems that are now having to coexist. One is, of course, the liberal international order that, as we just discussed, was not always and not very liberal and violated its own principles several times. You still have many countries that will use international law, free trade, and multilateralism as their justificatory languages. But this liberal international order is weakened, emptied of meaning, reinterpreted, compartmentalized, and it's no more seen as a kind of universally constraining order. So this kind of institutional normative liberal order is in fact inertia. And I think it's very important to frame it like that because liberalism never represented itself as inertia. And I think if you want a wake-up call for liberalism, it's important to see itself not as progressive or reformist, but as inertia. And I think that's what the liberal international order is now. Then you have a second normative system that is pushing for a more equitable multipolar order, pushing for de-Westernization. In a sense, you could define that normative system as post-liberalism in a thicker way, right, with more ideological content and strategies to transform the liberal international order. It's all the kind of post-colonial critiques of liberal asymmetries, with narratives based on sovereignty, development, civilizational pluralisms, and the right to multi-alignment. And so what this normative order is trying to tell us is that it's not that we have to dismantle the global governance, but we have to rebalance the international order. So it's a kind of alternative legitimacy strategy of reforming the liberal world order. And that has been mostly, let's say, global South countries. And then you have a third normative order that has been, in fact, evolving, which is the kind of the revisionist one. For very long, being a revisionist country or power on the international scene was being part of this kind of resistance to the US axis, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and Russia joining as the great power of this revisionist order. As it was said, the fact that now it's the main hegemon that was the core of liberalism that has become the leading revisionist power, that is the US, it's changing the definition of what it means to be a revisionist power, that you're no more the marginalized one on the international scene and the one that are heavily punished for being a dissident of the liberal international order. It's the hegemon now that is at the core of this revisionist power with narrative based on hierarchy, sphere of influence, territorial control. And so it's shifting the notion of revisionism toward a form of new imperiality that Russia has been embracing and that the US is also embracing, while for very long being a revisionist power was not linked to any kind of imperial or territorial conquest aspect. This revisionist normative order, if we can call it like that, because it by itself doesn't want to present itself as very normative, is based on narrative of security imperatives, historical entitlement, and civilizationist narrative, which in that case they share with the kind of reformist aspect. What I think the case of the US now under Trump is showing us is that for very long the cost of being a revisionist power was very high. Now the reputational and legal cost of using force has been falling down, and it's now seems to be a pretty cheap strategy. So what the US is doing is that they are changing the boundaries of acceptable behavior on the international scene to a scope that was never seen before. So this kind of revisionist normative order is much more revolutionary and in a kind of backlashing strategy, positioning toward the international order much more than the reformist kind of multipolar order. So what I think when I say that we are now in this kind of multi-normative order is that each country can choose which of the three normative packages they want. And I think every country wants a little bit of the three of them. Right? Everybody wants still a little bit of the liberal inertia because it's still part of the legal and institutional realities. Many countries would like the kind of reformist, transformational, multipolar order. And you want it or you don't want it, everybody will have to be a little bit revisionist just because you have to react to the revisionist move. And I give you the example of European countries having to move right now troops to Greenland. It's not that EU would like to militarize Greenland, it's just that you have no choice because you have to face a revisionist power that is threatening. So everybody will become revisionist even against their own will. The key issue is, of course, the relationship between the three kind of normative order. You would imagine that the liberal international order and those who are pushing for a kind of reformist, multipolar, more equitable world order would work together. The problem is that the liberal international order has been very bad at trying to reform itself and has been very bad at accepting the reformist push. So I think that strategy has been kind of failing, and that's why I was saying the liberal world order is very much based on inertia and statu quo defense and not on kind of reforming itself, even if liberalism always presents itself as self-reforming. On the international scene, you cannot really say it has been successful institutionally. So what we have seen is the kind of coalition emerging between those who would like to reform the international order and those who would like to revise the international order. And on that, Russia has been playing a very key role because Russia is both of them. For the European international order, Russia is a revisionist power, right? Just want to change the system as it is because it doesn't like it. And the war in Ukraine is the extreme version of a revisionist strategy. But on a lot of other issues that are not Eurocentric, Russia is a reformist country of the international order that can totally partner with all the countries who would like a more multipolar, equitable world order. And Russia can afford that because what makes the difference between the US and the Russian kind of imperial revisionist power is that Russia's imperial claims are limited to its region. So Russia is an hegemon, an imperial hegemon only for the post-Soviet space. But it's not for the world. So it can dialogue with the rest of the world in an easier way than the US renewed imperialism that seems to be applied to the whole planet. So Russia has been building over the year a really kind of well-calibrated strategies of saying, well, if you want de-Westernization and you want kind of non-Western world to emerge, you will have to partner with those who are anti-Western country. Non-Western and anti-Westernism have to work together, even if we are not always sharing element. And that has been its strategy toward the Global South, and that worked pretty well. China is an interesting case because China is playing a little bit of the three normative package, right? Keeping the liberal status quo, being clearly a reformist of the international order, but also being revisionist either for its own same kind of regional sphere of influence or accepting to partner with big revisionist countries like Russia, for example. What is interesting is that when Trump arrived in power last year, you had two possible strategies for a Trumpist on Trumpian foreign policy. You could have imagined the kind of civilizationist narrative moving toward an isolationist policy and a restrainer policy. And in that case, this kind of Trumpist foreign policy could have, at least in theory, be more or less like the Russian one and moving toward like this kind of, okay, we don't want the liberal international order, we want to reform it, we believe in this kind of normative civilizational multipolarity and so on. But it seems now very clear that the shift is in fact toward a vision of US revisionist foreign policy that will be interventionist, unilateral, and will be, and is therefore directly clashing with the kind of the reformist world order on Israel first, on the relationship to China, on well, Venezuela, what will be happening to Cuba, to Iran are the key elements. So it will be interesting to see the fact that the US revisionism is now so much clashing with the reformist normative order will recreate the possibility for the liberals and the reformists to try to work together against the revisionist, which is, of course, the strategy that Russia hoped to gain from what is happening currently. So I think it's interesting to try to think of both the three great powers, the US, Russia, and China, and the way they play with the three normative order and how this kind of, all the other countries are themselves trying to find this kind of multi-normativity and multi-alignment strategy to try to gain the best they can from this very chaotic situation. I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think a lot has been said. I wonder if I have lots to add, but I have a few points to make in addressing the key questions of this roundtable. I felt I needed to make 3 indispensable moves, really, to try to capture what's going on at the moment and where we might be heading. So to tackle the question on whether the so-called liberal international order is eroding, and to explore what kind of international system is emerging, I thought we first need to understand the nature of the international system of the past 7 decades, at least since the end of World War II. Second, we need to have a deeper understanding of the current crisis, namely to capture what exactly is being disrupted. Lastly, drawing on the first 2 steps, I would like to offer a speculation on the emerging international order. I call it a speculation simply because really no one has a definitive answer about where things might be heading. In tackling the questions, I felt the need to liberate myself from the constraints or impositions of the concept of liberalism, or the liberal international order, or post-liberalism. As scholars, I felt we need to remind ourselves that the liberal order is not only a set of institutions and rules, as the classical definition has it, but also liberalism, or the liberal international order, is also an ideology. And I think this is where Lynda's PhD advisors are victims of, really. They thought, because they believe the ideology. A better way to approach the question is to think about how the global order is actually organized. Let's keep the idea of liberalism to the side for a moment, and then think about how has the world more or less organized the international arena. Because there is a feeling now, it's almost the opposite of 1990, when Francis Fukuyama announced the end of history and the triumph of liberalism. It seems now we've moved to the other extreme to say liberalism is dead and we're in the post-liberal era. I think both are wrong, to be honest. The international system has never been a liberal international system. This is my central argument, which pushes a bit what has been said a little bit further, but I think I do agree with my colleagues. First, the global order is about conflict and attempts at cooperation, which require institutions. A key principle of the international order, which exists in international institutions, is the principle of sovereignty. And whether this agrees with liberalism or not, I leave this to a different discussion. But sovereignty is a key principle. And usually the ideological basis of sovereignty is nationalism, not liberalism. It's a totally different ideology. Hence, if you have just briefly discussed the global system since 1945, you realize that during the Cold War, we had 3 orders. You had a bipolar world, a huge master division between the Soviet Union and America. Then you had the second level, a subsystem of communist states under Warsaw and the capitalist states. And this is where you see more or less some liberal or traces of liberal ideology. But even then, it wasn't really a very liberal system. Because, you know, the US during the Cold War supported dictatorship even within the Western alliances. Greece, Portugal, Turkey, these weren't necessarily democratic states. So you could offer many, many other systems. And you also had, of course, a level of institutionalization represented in the United Nations, which more or less offered the arena for states to cooperate. But the two great powers also established their own institutions to really prevent the eradication of humanity. In the post-Cold War era, you have the collapse of communism and the growth of the Western-led international system. Once again, it wasn't a purely liberal international order. It had traces of it. And by traces of it, I mean free trade, the idea that norms should guide and regulate in state interactions, the WTO. But during that process, other countries came into the so-called Western-led international system, including, of course, China and an attempt by the Western states to reform Russia in the post-communist period. So there was a growth of Western-led system. But during that period, we need to remind ourselves the US did not necessarily, or Western countries for that matter, did not necessarily act according to liberal principles. They acted primarily according to notions of sovereignty and nationalism. When George W. Bush could not get an approval from the UN to invade Iraq, he called it the coalition of the willing. It was an illegal war. He still did it. And the US during that period engaged in more than 7 or 8 wars. We need to remind ourselves. And that's very important. During that period, of course, you had other states prioritizing nationalism and sovereignty like Russia. Britain and Brexit, that's within the EU, a major country thinking of exiting the EU, which also indicated challenges to the whole idea of the institution. So all this is to say that the global order has been more or less, the main dynamic has been about conflict and ways to manage conflict. Two ideologies have been fighting, liberalism, true, but also nationalism. So what exactly is happening now? It's a moment where there is a crisis because, as Harith mentioned earlier, the leading power that was more or less propagating liberalism to the rest of the world is now a victim of the international political economy, led by an administration that is more or less, there are two factors that motivate the administration at the moment. One is a feeling of victimhood. There is this victimhood always being mentioned by Trump and the MAGA movement as a whole, that the US has been a victim of this so-called liberal international system, and now it's the time to bring America, to make America first. But this victimhood, you have to add to it also that this is the most powerful state on earth, not to say in history. So very two dangerous drives here. A bit reminiscent of the Nazi regime in before the Second World War, because you have victimhood on the one hand and you have the power on the other hand. And there's this feeling of American decline that is also perpetuated by a change in the international system, the rise of China and the quest for more power by Russia and other countries around the world. So there is a panic in the system, and this panic is represented by Mr. Trump, who might be peculiar on many levels, but to be honest, he's not also totally out of touch. You had George Bush behaving in similar ways. Remember Barack Obama, who is, of course, a more restrained, more cautious leader, also was trying to pivot towards the East. He wanted to make his first trip to Asia rather than to Germany or Europe. So there is this American feeling of decline, and that's causing this panic and a feeling of hubris. And that's a very dangerous moment when America cannot see the world as it is. sadly, in the region, Netanyahu is also having a feeling of hubris that's dangerous for us here. Now, this American behavior is also leading to reactions by others, which you mentioned the required reaction. Europe now has no other option but to unite, because there's a Russian threat from the east and now an American threat from the west. Once again, this is not the first time the US and Europe diverge in their own foreign policies. It happened a lot in history, especially between the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US. Is it all gloom and doom? I don't think so, because the world still needs to regulate its alliances. The world still needs to regulate its cooperation. At this moment, we're seeing the EU signing a trade agreement with Latin America. It's a huge 700 million people market. This requires rules and regulations, liberal or otherwise, so the world is not going into a state of total anarchy. But I do still think in this interregnum where the Americans want to use the time to dominate over the world, I think China wants to still play by the rules. And the Europeans might pick on that opportunity, and you might see new alliances around the world, which may, only may, reinvigorate the international institutions and rules. Because these institutions and rules are activated by states who are the principal actors in international arena, or deactivated when these rules are against their own interests. So what might be emerging is two things. I think I might have crossed the time. I'll finish in 1 minute. Two things. One, we might see the US being more isolated in the international arena, because the way Trump is behaving, it's quite aggressive, and it's causing panic and anxiety at the international system. I think on the long term, America is losing its leverage over other allies and enemies. So we might see an American power that is isolated, and Kissinger has spoken about this for in many occasions. But also we might be observing a hybrid system where the dynamic between sovereignty and international institution will continue to be active. In some cases, strengthening international institutions, in others, weakening them. So nothing so new, as my colleagues have mentioned, and the world continues to be as it has forever been, but it's more of a moment where it could potentially be dangerous given the behavior of the American administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Adham, and thank you all for having respected the time limits. Before you engage with each other, please allow me to engage with you first, just to kickstart a little bit some interaction. Amanda, you said that, I totally agree with you, that there is definitely a little cooperation from the states, and you define the multilateral cooperation as being driven by states, which is absolutely true. But at the same time, talking about governance, we know that many non-state actors, especially NGOs, have been engaged in this process. So my question is, did they make a difference? Did you really have an influence? And in the future, would they have some influence on this cooperation gap? My question to Harith, you also said that there is some decline and gaps left by mainly the US in terms of the cooperation of the multilateralism. And you cited the example of the US withdrawing aid and leaving a gap, financial and other gaps that haven't been filled. Don't you think that China, especially the Road and Belt Initiative, is a form of response to this aid, but with the new norms, new rules, of course, centered on China interest. Lynda, I totally agree with you that there have been so many institutions, especially from the Global South, or the so-called Global South, because it's still a concept that needs to be clearly defined. And that, but you said that they constituted an order, and here I have, I have a difference, and I don't agree, because I think one of the issues that we're witnessing is that we do have so many Global South institutions, especially the BRICS, but they didn't manage to, the way I understand it, didn't manage to set the rules and norms to the extent that they would constitute an order. And here they take us to probably the real issue, the disorder that we're witnessing today is due to the fact that the old order, including institutions, norms, rules, and governance, is dying, but the new is not being born, is not born yet. And this, of course, takes us to Antonio Gramsci talking about the 30s. We're living through the monstrous times because of this shift hasn't been really, it's operating, but it hasn't set on a clear order. Marlene, you also talked about the shift of liberal paradigms. And don't you think that the U.S. revisionist foreign policy is rather adapting to the new potential hegemon, China, and creating a new world order that is neither liberal, nor illiberal? So this is the angle I think that could reflect on. And Adham, the conflict-ridden order has been there since the beginning, as you said, the competition between the Eastern and Western blocs, but there was at least some balance of order, especially during the Cold War. And that's probably what's missing. Don't you think also that this rapprochement, the fact that, as you said, China is still interested in playing by the rules, and probably Trump would be willing to have some rapprochement with China. Don't you think that this could be a chance for balancing power between these two new blocs? And okay, so please, if you can interact with these questions and also with each other. Thank you.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think yes, and I apologize for having given all of these NGOs the short end of the stick in my discussion. I think actually you're very right. The non-state actors and the NGOs are essentially holding the international migration regime afloat, in fact. So they're doing most of the heavy lifting. Some critics even sort of look at the United Nations and the UNHCR as basically just an umbrella organization for all of these other real organizations on the ground to do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to everything related to refugees or to migration. And I think this goes also back to my colleague Lynda's point, which is that there have always been these organizations and partnerships and agreements and networks and collaborations that have existed on a regional, on a local, on a bi-national basis that have existed before this sort of so-called liberal international order will continue to exist after it. And so, the scholars of the UN and those who studied the UN in the context of migration essentially ask, what good is this organization? What can it do that these organizations couldn't do without them? So, yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Before answering your question, because I wanted to engage with my colleagues about some of the things that have been said, especially the idea raised by Lynda, and to some extent also Adham, the idea that the world was always like that. There has never been a liberal order. So I agree with the notion that the world was always unequal, was always messy. There were always a powerful and a powerless. But at the same time, as someone who studies political institutions, I think institutions matter. And institutions over time create norms, values, set of practices that become eventually routinized and people get used to them. So what's happening, you have this idea this was going on all the time. But no, there are always periods of stabilization, institutionalization, normalization of certain norms and practices and values. And then there are the moments of ruptures, which is why I think describing the current moment as interregnum, as Adham did, is completely right, and I agree with it. So I just, for example, in the 70s, the third world countries tried to establish an alliance, the non-aligned organization. They tried to strengthen their own bargaining power vis-a-vis the West and the East. And yes, there hasn't been much progress since then, but there has been some attempts to alter the balance of power at that moment. So also the idea of the West, sometimes we talk about West-East, sometimes we talk about North-South, and the West probably has a more cultural element than North-South. But what is happening today, in my view, is that the very category of the West is under question. Like now, when we see the growing rivalry between the U.S. and Europe, Trump's vice president attacking the Europeans in their own land, there is something is changing. So the West is changing itself. There is a process of realignment that cannot be just seen like compared with the previous moments in the past. Then Marlene's idea about multi-normativity, which I agree with it to some extent, but there is another way to look at it probably, is because the way you say it, it seems that there are different powers are emerging and they are negotiating, and each power has its own normative system. But also, why don't you think about it also as the superpower, the hegemon, wants to unburden itself from the cost of being the hegemon and the norms that constrained this hegemon before. Because this is what seems to me Trump is doing. Trump is saying, I don't care about the international order, I don't care about the UN, he withdrew from more than 70 international organizations or treaties, but at the same time he continues to say, I solved 8 or 11 wars, I don't know.
I know. Depends on the day.
How many wars? Congo, Thailand, Gaza, everywhere. And he's so concerned about the Iranians. This is not exactly multi-normativity. What I see it is that there is still a superpower. Mm-hmm. There is still a superpower, a power that is the greatest, has the greatest economy in the globe, the greatest military power, with him seeking to increase the military spending from $900 billion to $1.5 trillion. That's huge. That's almost 10, 20 times the income of all Arab countries, right? So there is still a superpower, and there are great powers. China is an economic superpower, but still not yet a military superpower. Russia is military superpower in the sense that they have nuclear weapons, but as we saw in the war with Ukraine, Russia is not able to finish that war, the special operation, as Putin called it. So we need to think, I think, again, the idea of interregnum is also correct, because this is a process of transition. We don't know whether there will be a multipolar system, or again, the superpower will reassert its own power and defeat its own rivals. Just one point, Adham, about Iraq, and because you did this comparison, Bush did the same thing that Trump did. But remember, when Bush tried to invade Iraq, he went to the U.S. Security Council. He went to the UN. He tried to, many times, to convince other countries to support him. And only when he couldn't do that, he decided to do it, also not unilaterally, but he went with the UK. He got some help from other countries. I think there was 35 countries that came to Iraq. I remember Polish soldiers in Karbala streets, Spanish soldiers in Anbar. So there was a multilateral coalition. I agree with the point you raised about Europe today has no option but to unite. But because this is a very difficult option, right? Europe is still divided. There are many decision makers. So there is another option for Europe, is doing nothing. And that could, especially if in major countries such as France, far-right government comes that is more concerned about national interest than European interest. UK, I know UK is not part of the European Union, but if the far-right government in the UK,
come back, believe me.
we'll see. But in general, I agree with the point you raised with this possibility. But also, let's think about the possibility of Europe doing nothing.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. I'll also start with, engaging with Harith on his points. Yes, institutions do matter. They better matter, because if not, my job is at stake. But yeah, they're very important. And I think they will still continue to matter. Like right now we have, in terms of formal international organizations, we have about 50,000 of them. So institutions continue to evolve and continue to be procreated, but it also means that there is something wrong with the older institutions that we have, and that is why we see more and more formal institutions being created. So definitely they do matter, and I also agree with you that the relationship between Europe and the US is changing. I don't want to kind of like predict what would happen, because I don't know. Those two actors have aligned for so long that I don't even see the possibility of disentangling that engagement. But contest me, if you feel to. And I also agree with you that it's, the fact that regardless of the fact that, Trump is withdrawing from these international organizations, a lot of these leaders still utilize them as legitimacy tools. And we see that in the case of African regionalism as well. And this goes back to your point. I find it difficult to look at, African regionalism, or, for the lack of a better term, like we said, Global South interaction as old and new. And probably because I'm looking at it from, looking at the evolution of African regional organizations, this has a lot of what we see happening today in African regionalism is as a result of, arrangements or orders in the past that we have, the member states have seen that they have resolved and then built new institutions off of that. So if you look at the Organization of African Unity and the fact that it was created to pursue decolonization, that automatically evolved, post-1994, when they felt that, okay, with the end of apartheid, member states had gained independence, and we now need to look at African states as independent states, and how can we develop even further good governance, so which led to the African Union, and then to the the African peer review mechanism, which monitors good governance across the continent. So I do agree that, okay, and then to the point that they haven't managed to set in an order. I think I'm interpreting that question from a perspective of norm discourse and practice and implementation. So, I usually say the African Union is great at coming up with ideas. They have great institutions, great norms, very well-structured treaties. Member states coming and they sign it, and there are, props and photos, and it's all on the news. But implementation has always been a problem, and I think that's a challenge that we face today and would continue to face if more authority is not given to African institutions. I would say this is the same for a regional order like the BRICS. It is nice to come together in those summits and have those conversations and, sign treaties, but, there is still a gap between theory and practice, or, norm discourse and implementation. And that's one challenge that we'll continue to face, and we need to find a way to deal with it. But I liked your point, Adham, about China following the rules, because I got a sense of that the more I interacted with a lot of, African Union bureaucrats. And, you say, whoever pays the piper takes the tune. So the struggle that they've always had over time, and I'm saying this in the context that 90% of African Union programs are funded by outside, from external actors, and this is a major problem. And, they would always say, when we meet with the Europeans, it's always about, we're going to give you the money, and this is what we need you to do. And with China, it's, we don't care about your governance. We don't care about changing anything about your political structure. This is the funding we're giving you. This is where we want you to earmark it for certain projects. And that is what they like. And I think this is why I say that, the kind of like the power politics within the African continent now is a crisis of not a crisis, but one of opportunity for African, institutions, because now they can forum shop amongst all these powers. It's not just dependent now on the EU. It can reach out to Russia, it can reach out to China, and there's more room to bargain.
Shop around.
Exactly, shop around. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all the comments. 3 very brief points. One on the notion of interregnum, which I like and which I use also, but I think we should also be careful not to believe in the transition narrative, like, oh, there was an order, then now it's a disorder, and then we are in the transition period for a new order. Well, maybe no, maybe that is, right? The disorder is the new normal, so maybe we should also be careful not to hope for something orderly to arrive. Maybe what we have is not a transition, it is how it will be for a long time. So just for us to think of that, just cannot resist, of course, the EU stuff. I think the risk of doing nothing is a serious probability for the EU, because resisting Russia is one thing. Trying to resist US is such a difficult political, intellectual, symbolic, emotional process for many European countries that they are a little bit like, the rabbit paralyzed with the light of the car arriving. So I'm not sure they will be able to make it. And then the third key point on the US. I think what makes the Trump administration so revolutionary in a way, right? It's precisely because they know, or at least that's their vision, that it's the last windows of time for the US to stay the hegemon. And to stay the hegemon, you need to reshuffle everything. You need to free yourself from the cost of being the hegemon, from the law, but you also need to take the lead in reinventing what it means to be a great power in the second half of the 20th century. And I think that's what Trump is doing, right? He's creating the future. He's the one having imagination on his side. We don't have it. Right? So the way this projection of what it means to be a great power in the second half of the 20th century, what they are doing is like, so we see the kind of the return of the empire as a territorialized things like taking Greenland, trying to take other overthrowing regimes, but they also prepare for a deterritorialized definition of what is a great power, right? It's all the digital infrastructure that will shape the world in where we will live. It's totally transforming the military power and preparing for the war of the future with no human being being involved, right? It's preparing for the de-dollarization of the international scene by shifting to cryptocurrency and becoming the leading kind of cryptocurrency power. It's having private actor now being the state, the American state, are private actor. I mean, the level of fusion and blending is very strong. So I think that while we are dealing with the present of American revisionisms and trying to follow Trump, they are preparing the future, right? And so I think that's one of the tensions that we have, is that it's very difficult to follow that recreation of what it will be to be the hegemon because we are just dealing with the hegemon changing the world order now, but they are preparing the hegemony, the definition of what is a hegemon in the future, and we are far away from being able to follow on that.
Okay, thank you. Few points to address. Let me start with Harith's idea on the importance of institutions. I hope I didn't come across as a radical anarchist here, because no, of course, norms matter, and thank God they do, because otherwise you could just imagine what the world would be like without norms and institutions. Of course, they matter. They constrain the behavior of states. Even the US, in seizing Maduro, had to make a legal argument about it. So the introduction of norms in the international arena changed the world. And liberalism played a key role in this. But we need to remind ourselves once again that the international normative structure also includes in its fabric the principle of sovereignty, which is based on the ideology of nationalism. That's also part of the international normative structure. So when any leader in the world says, I'm giving priority for my own country, that's not illegal. It might be illiberal or against liberal notions, fine, but that's not illegal, and that's crucial. It's true, I get your point on Iraq. One reason why the US went to the UN is because institutions matter. But in the same episode, they also decided that we're the most powerful. We don't care if you don't give us the legal permit, we could still do it on our own. Once again, the international system is reflecting its two faces. And now we see it in Trump's idea. Let me say something, what I conceive as the interregnum. It's not just a transitional period, because a transitional period assumes a transition to something else. That's not, I don't dare to say this, because we could live in this period, as you said, for a long time. I think by interregnum, I had in mind a specific thing. The US believes it could now act without anyone able to stop it. It's a time period, and they feel they have to act quickly, and before China is strong enough to say stop. But sooner or later, this expansion will knock on China's doors somewhere. It's now knocking on the European door. And so this is what I mean by interregnum. I think, Trump is doing it in his own style, but other administrations, I would imagine, would have done it in a different way. Which brings me to Europe's doors. Can the Europeans afford to do nothing? If you look at European pattern, you might reach the conclusion that Marlene has reached. They probably do nothing. But I think it's crucial now to Europe's ontological security as well to its material security. Doing nothing means an occupation of Greenland. And it would raise then the question of who protects Sweden now. Sweden has raised its voice. Who would protect the weaker states in the Union, but ultimately Germany, France, and the UK? Who would ultimately protect them? It's a key issue. And if the Europeans cannot answer this question, the whole idea of a sovereign state within Europe and the whole idea of the EU as a security community, a normative community, will collapse. There is an opportunity, and I think if you look at some of the statements coming out of Berlin, Paris, and London, there is a hint about moving closely. They will not wait for EU institutions to play the democratic liberal game. There's no time. They'll have to rush to do something. And you would have to look for these three key states. But this time around, it's a bit different than the Iraq War. Eastern Europeans, who historically would have wanted to be with the US, now are threatened by Russia. So they have an interest in some EU security kind of umbrella. So there are signs that things might be moving in that direction. How slow will it succeed? I have no idea. But Europe is under threat on many levels. The last point is on your point on balancing. I think the war between the US and China has started.
Agree.
And what happened in Venezuela is the starting
I
point.
agree.
It's going to take time. But basically what the US is doing is trying to contain China, ultimately isolate it. That's the hope. Now, whether the US will succeed is a totally different story. What do you expect in these situations? Well, China will, of course, try to counterbalance. So, but there is the interregnum. And in the interregnum, the US is acting like the world's policeman.
Yeah.
Or Trump is doing so.
Well, thank you so much for this very rich and thought-provoking remarks and interaction between you others. So now we open the floor to the audience, and we'll take one question from each side. We'll start with John, then Abdelilah. We have, can we have please some headsets for the translation for this second question? And from this side, do we have any questions? Okay, the gentleman on the side. So, John, please go ahead. And we'll continue with the other questions.
Well, thank you very much to each of you for a very important, very stimulating session. I have two remarks. The first is about, the fuzziness, continuing fuzziness of this definition of the international liberal order. I'm no clearer after this session of what it means, and you yourselves are not exactly agreed about it. I think if we had a historian or two here, this is not ad hominem remarks, they would point out that the post-45 American-led liberal order, as it is called, comprised two phases. In the first phase, there is new institution building, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the IBRD, the UN, NATO. It was a period in which interest rates were low, in which governments committed themselves to welfare schemes. It was socially liberal. And it was a period in which trade unions became much stronger, and in which there was a strong liberal spirit, of which Kennedy was, so to say, the high point. So if you ask what is the ILO, in this first phase, it's rules-based, it's an attempt to constitutionalize power. It is free trade, yes, but it's also socially liberal, often called social democracy. The second, there's a rupture in the 70s. This is a nuance that I thought was missing, in which actually the property commodification dynamics of liberalism become ever stronger. Privatization of everything. A continuing attachment to rules-based order, so to say. Lots of military interventions by the dominant power, more than 100 in this second phase after the 1970s. Corporate tax rates plummet. The WTO and the World Bank are created. The Soviet Union collapses, China returns, and the privatization of so many things, of welfare services, produces a huge growing gap between rich and poor and plants the seeds of the crisis of liberalism. I just thought, I mean, this is obviously one interpretation of this very complex period, but it seems to me thinking like that in two phases and very carefully defining the word liberal makes better sense of the international liberal order. One other second comment, I softened my views, but to Harith, I think we should have a good discussion about China. Once again, I think one actor missing in the winter school is a Chinese scholar or two who would talk very differently and I would say in more complicated terms about what is going on. This is not a power which is a status quo power, I think, Harith. I think that it's not adapting to the selective retreat and withdrawal of the United States. It's the largest army, with respect. The Belt and Road Initiative shows that it's now, of course, the largest trader, the largest global investor. It's outcompeting the United States in matters of AI and robotics and electric vehicles. De-dollarization is going on the quiet, but accelerating. The first state-led cryptocurrency scheme, well before the United States. Trump is in the dust, so to say. The spread of a diplomatic class that is operating and very sophisticated globally. It wants, yes, to preserve the WTO, as it did, you may not know, during the Trump administration, where Trump tried to kill it by destroying the appellate court, by not appointing judges. And who stepped in? Led by China, with Canada, Australia, New Zealand. China steps in to appoint the judges to keep the WTO going. And it wants to keep the UN going, but it's also building a whole clutch of new institutions. This is not Chinese propaganda. I'm just trying to describe to you that we've got an empire that is being built. And my view is that some of you, as realists or post-realists or neoclassical realists, the spirit was very strong. You even use the word hegemon. It belongs to that paradigm. I think you underestimate, actually, the trouble that the United States is in, and the National Security Review, I think, is worth revisiting. There was not one mention of it. This is a withdrawal to the Western Hemisphere. And it is a signal and an announcement that the international liberal order no longer serves the interests of the United States. Rubio says it in every other speech. So 2 points, really. One about clarification of the phrase international liberal order and the need to take into account 2 phases. And the other is, it seems to me, a serious underestimation of China. I live in the China zone, and I kind of feel in my bones the big shift that's going on. It is a very big shift, and I would say the word empire needs to be brought back into the discussion.
Thank you, John. Abdullah, can you please use the
أنا شكرا. عندي تعقيب بالعربي وعندي سؤال بالإنجليزي السيدة ليندا. أبدأ بالسيدة ليندا. We are all African. We are all from Mama Africa, and we're fighting for Africa, for free Africa for the Africans. My question is, why was Africa until now unable to liberate the rest of? Why was Africa until now unable to liberate the rest of its colonies? We have in Morocco, I'm from Morocco. Sabta and Melilla and some small islands in the north. We have Canaries Islands in the western of Morocco. We have islands in Jazor al-Qomor Islands, and we have Reunion in Mozambique Canal. بالنسبة للتعليق على الدكتور أدهم والدكتور حارث، أنا عندي 3 ملاحظات. الملاحظة الأولى تتعلق بما يمكن أن نسميه برجل العالم المريض. رجل العالم المريض الآن، يعني كما كان أطلقته القيصر الروسي على الإمبراطورية العثمانية، هو أوروبا. للأسف النخبة الأوروبية في وضع من الانحطاط الشديد. يعني كل المسؤولين الأوروبيين، خاصة في الدول ال3 الكبرى، إنجلترا، فرنسا، ألمانيا، لديهم قصر نظر فظيع في مواجهة الواقع الجيوستراتيجي. يعني هم مضللون من طرف التحالف مع أمريكا في سياق الناتو، ويدفع بهم في إطار السردية الإنجليزية التي تعتبر روسيا خارج أوروبا في صراع مع روسيا، ثم يأتي الذئب الأمريكي اللي هو ترامب لكي يسيطر على جرينلاند ويفتح أمام أوروبا يعني أبواب الجحيم. في المقلب الآخر هناك نصف الكأس الممتلئ الذي ينبغي أن نتأمله. هناك تحالف أوراسي، يعني الصين وروسيا. هناك حدث قبل يومين طبعا لم يتم الانتباه إليه في سياق هذا يعني الجعجعة الكبيرة التي يطرحها ترامب، يعني الاتفاق بين الاتحاد الأوروبي والميركوسور، وهو تغير جيوستراتيجي كبير جدا. ثم أيضا في الصورة الأخرى، يعني ما يتعلق بنا نحن جيوستراتيجيا كعرب، هناك أيضا رجل مريض آخر في هذا العالم وهو الوطن العربي. الذي تجري على أرضه واحدة من أهم المعارك في التاريخ الإنساني، لكننا غائبون كعرب عن أن نفعل في التاريخ. هذه هي أيضا مشكلتنا، وهي تؤثر على العالم أيضا. غياب العرب عن العالم يخلق إشكالا كبيرا بالنسبة للعالم. شكرا.
Thank you. So we go to the gentleman and then we move back to the lady.
Yes, Walid al-Saqaf from the journalism program here at the Doha Institute. One thing that captured my attention is that we are looking at the macro image of what is going on in geopolitics as we speak. However, when you look into the internal White House politics, within the White House itself, looking at the pathetic attitudes that are being shown from, for example, the demolishing of the White House, the renaming of the Kennedy Center. This might eventually be a one-man show being portrayed to the whole world as an institutional, regime. So this is something that might not necessarily be a reflection of reality, but it might be a possibility, because just today, I don't know if you've heard, Trump sent out an email asking for donations saying, I am alone in this room, a creepy email, if you may, but it reflects something very disturbing of how the White House dynamics are being played out, something that might shape the world. It reminds me of someone else. Who? Hitler. So one man can actually be reshaping the globe, and we're not really talking about that aspect, but rather of the overall macro dynamics. Thank you.
Okay, so any questions from this side? Yes, Devlin.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Lynda. First, Arid Diab.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, I'm Arid Diab, and I'm a first-year student here at Doha Institute in the Sociology and Anthropology program. I want to thank Professor Lynda for a very insightful intervention. I particularly appreciate your emphasis on regionalism and your grounding of the analysis in the conversation within Africa Union bureaucrats, which foreground African institution agency rather than external interpretations. You noted that the intensification of engagement with actors such as China and Russia is often welcome within the African institutions, as it creates greater room for maneuver beyond long-standing Western dominance. In this context of the Roundtable, I want to ask about your opinion of how would you assess these limits of this expanding bargaining space. I mean, at what point does diversification of partnership enhance Africa agency? And at what point may it risk reproducing new form of dependency of Africa?
Yeah. Thank you. Any question from this side? We'll move to the other one. The gentleman, and then you, and then yourself. Just the good news, we will take all the questions. Please go ahead.
My question is to Dr. Adham. Maybe I'm playing a bit of a devil advocate with it. But you've mentioned that sovereignty is the ideology of nationalism. Now, when you've said that, like three historical tensions popped up in my mind. Mainly the fact that the concept of sovereignty predates nationalism as a concept or as a movement. Sovereignty was, we can see the concept in Bowden's work on the books on Commonwealth and Hobbes's famous Leviathan, whereas nationalism is a movement that was on a mass scale ignited in the 18th century. Another historical tension is the fact that perhaps the enduring articulations of sovereignty are to be found in liberal constitutional movements, particularly through the 76 American Revolution and the 1789 French Revolution. And a third tension is that where we have seen a rise of nationalism, we have seen a threat of sovereignty across Europe, across different regions. And this is seen in the World War II with Hitler and the like. So if you can defend the claim that nationalism is the ideology of sovereignty, I would really appreciate that.
Okay, so yes, please go ahead.
This goes to Professor Saouli. Looking forward, you said that you anticipate an international order that is a hybrid one. That's for the future, but that begs the question, what kind of order have we had so far? I'm sorry if you articulated that, but I didn't catch it, but I'd like to hear it in clearer terms. And the other thing is more of a comparative politics question. It's not addressed to a specific lecturer. Do you think that, feel free to answer, do you think that the fact that European democracies imply that politicians and heads of states need to think in election cycles has hindered the liberal international order vis-a-vis a country like China, where they think in terms of decades, or less so the US, where they have a less party system, so the details that are changing in between are less frequent and less apparent? And a comment to Amanda. I agree on all the points that you raised, but also I think looking at Western countries, there is a tendency of being less liberal in terms of democracies. In terms of Western countries between each other, all these electronic visas that popped up all of a sudden, the UK, the US raising the fee, Australia, New Zealand, Schengen is going to do the same for Americans, Brits, and Canadians, and Australians. Those are also a sign that goes in the same direction, which I also find very unfortunate. So, thank you so much.
Thank you all for this very interesting roundtable. I personally learned a lot. My question is directed to Amanda. You argued that the international system has always operated in this way, and indeed there is definitely a lot of truth in that. But given the rise of populist authoritarian movements all over the world, can we not argue that the conditions by which racialized bodies have to live through as they attempt to cross borders or during their brief stay in the country that they try to travel to actually have become worse? And here I think about conditions within detention or the deployment of forces such as ICE, or even social hostility that they have to deal with within the country that they're in, US, UK, Poland. Certainly this is not applied to immigrants from more acceptable racial groups, such as white South Africans going to the US, or white Ukrainians going to the UK. So in this sense, indeed, the international system or international governance always operated in this way, but could we understand it not necessarily as post-liberalism, but an exacerbation of the illiberal way in which it has been applied thus far? And I centralize here populist authoritarian movements and them coming into power, because before that, though the parties that were in power in the US, for example, or the UK, had some sort of an incentive to claim a narrative of moral superiority, or at least try to make an argument for it. But now that has been completely discarded, and I feel like it creates those conditions for the exacerbation of, the lived experience of these racialized bodies. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yes, please go ahead. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Do you hear me? Here you go. I am a student at the University of Oslo in the Faculty of Social Sciences of Social Anthropology. And I'm here visiting my friends, so I thought I was going to join. Anyway, I find this very, very interesting, and thank you for letting me join. I have a question because I read an article from Yarimar Bonilla some weeks ago, and she says that the concept of Westernness is it's definitely not a place. Being Western, that's a concept. And I was wondering what you guys' thoughts are on the concept of Western, or being Western, or a Western state. If there should be, if that is still valid, or if the concept of Westernness as we see it today with what is going on in the world is not only challenged but also maybe out of date? Is there a power in words like these? Or is it just is there something that gives us with keeping the name but changing the concept internally? Or is it something that we can rethink if the word is connected with action in a way, if you get my question? Is Western something we can talk about anymore? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for raising these questions. Any more questions? Yeah, Dr. Abdulwahab, yes. I think you will close with your question.
Thank you. I think, don't we need to reflect a little bit about what's happening in the United States regarding the global system? The complaints coming from Trump and his supporters seem to blame globalization for America's economic plight. And this reminds me that when the post-Cold War system began to coalesce as a liberal, as people say, system, it was the third world and the outsiders were complaining about globalization. And a lot of people were calling it an American attempt to America to take over the world. So it was seen as an American conspiracy by third world actors. And at one point, the EU was seen as the model of for all third world countries. A lot of them, especially in the Arab world, in Africa, they started to form kind of unions. But I remember also at the same time that when I was studying East Africa and the attempts to also regionalize there, I wrote a paper called The Perils of Regionalism, because I found that in East Africa, these countries in East Africa started like the European Union. Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania when they started, they had one central bank, one currency, free trade between them, and also even one university. The same happened when Eritrea and Ethiopia divided. They still also had the same thing: one currency, one central bank. Everything was united free trade. But both these arrangements ended into a war, into wars. And I thought that this will be something inherent in regionalism itself, because unless you, the European Union at that time, and also the global system, has compensated for this in being in expansion. And in this way, there was also a reversal. At one point, some people would benefit more from any union or any regional organization or any global system. And there was a point when America was benefiting, even in its own regional arrangement, Mexico and Canada. And then things didn't work. And the very kind of regionalism and the very kind of globalization, when countries like Korea and the tigers of Eastern Asia and so on began to benefit, so can we see that maybe this problem is inherent in the liberal system itself? as a system of international organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdulwahab. Any more questions? I think that's it. Okay, so now back to you. We can you can answer in the same order we started with.
Sure. Just
and take your time, Amanda. You haven't had a chance to elaborate.
No, it's fine. I think the question from Ali is a great one. I think maybe I was being a bit too generous to the United States when I described its or the world in that sense, when I described the order as a kind of having post-liberal features. But to piggyback off of Lynda's earlier question, I think we never had a golden age of liberalism. So I think the way that we operate now when it comes to international migration is effectively the way we've always operated. There hasn't been a change. Whether you want to call it liberalism or post-liberalism doesn't really matter. It's been relatively consistent. You know, countries have been detaining migrants for a long time. One could argue the conditions have never been particularly ideal in which they've been contained. Mass deportations happen periodically, right? As do mass regularizations, right? We see this sort of ebb and flow between extremely sort of liberal versus extremely the opposite policies between states over the course of history. So I think you know, the point in general is that honestly not much has changed in the world of international migration, the way states do it. My last point, I think, which was you know, getting at your question at this the sort of dehumanization of the migrant, which I highlighted as something that I think is actually significant. And it changes a little bit the rhetoric and the norms and the kind of expectations around a state's behavior when it comes to dealing with, or at least speaking about, international migration. I think we do see this sort of shift, again, in a kind of, you know, post-liberal direction, right, in a more restrictive, conservative direction. But again, we've seen this ebb and flow over the course of history. You have these sort of, you know, to the extent, again, that we're talking about a liberal order, you kind of have this high watermark of liberalism, which comes to a crashing halt with things like, you know, building walls and Brexit and what have you. You have these moments of surging and populist support that really do change things. But again, these aren't things we haven't seen before in some form or another, right? Thank you.
Thank you. About the point that John raised regarding China, which also will help me to answer your question. I forgot to answer it. I agree with you, yeah. China has the largest army, biggest number of engineers in the world. I'm very impressed about the huge technological advance in China. I was in China just last year, and that made me even more impressed. But I have a couple of points here. The one point that we need also to tackle is there is the open system versus the closed system. We know now it has been raised that electoral cycles and democracy is messy and make it difficult to make decisions, whether in Europe, whether in the U.S., and what happens after Trump is a big question. Would the U.S. will continue the same policy and direction or not? So that is portrayed by many as liability, while there are efficient authoritarian systems that can deliver immediately and are able to direct the economy, direct the whole policy of the state towards a clear objective, and China has mastered that perfectly. Yet there is also a weakness in a closed system like China, which is things might change suddenly if, for example, President Xi disappeared, passed away, for example. You don't know who's going to take power, whether the process of taking power will lead to conflict within the inner circle of the regime. So if democracy has the problem of moving very slowly, the messiness with it, there's also the problem with this type of systems that you cannot predict what could happen. Because there were people who were talking that at some point that the Soviet Union will dominate and will defeat the US. And suddenly, it seems that nobody predicted that the Soviet Union will collapse until it collapsed. So there are things that we need to think about it. So I agree with you about the power, China's rising power, but I'm very cautious about the inevitability of the way that this claim is being made, that simply the US is retreating, China is taking over. Then there's an issue here I wanted also to tackle. Now this idea of the sphere of influence, spheres of influence, that Donroe doctrine. The US will take the Americas, and China will have its own sphere of influence, Russia will have its own sphere of influence, and everybody's happy. But things are more complicated in my view. Because if the US clearly saying, this is my sphere of influence, and keeps pushing it, it's not only the Americas, it's the Greenland also. We don't know what is the sphere, what is China's sphere of influence. The process of demarcating the boundaries of China's sphere of influence could be very, very messy and very, very dangerous also. Because in my view, and I agree with the point that Adham made, China has an interest in keeping the global system, the open markets, because it benefited from it. China grew because the globe was its own market. Now, if you say there are spheres of influence, that you're pushing China out from some territories, that will force China to militarize in order to demarcate its own sphere of influence. Will the US be willing to accept China taking over of Taiwan, of expanding its own sphere of influence? I think this is not as easy as we imagine it, which the point also took, I want to connect this to the point raised by Dr. Walid. Yeah, I totally agree with you about the agency of the leader and his impact, and it could be this one-man show. But at the same time, two things to take into consideration. First, it is often said that if you want to know what Trump decided, you have to know who was the last one who met him, which means that there are forces competing to convince Trump to take this direction or that direction. The second point, we saw in the morning lectures how Trumpism rose. It was Trump's charisma and all these things, but also was the fact that the failure of the Democratic Party in articulating a message that resonates with the working class, with the people who feels harmed by globalization. So there's always a need to make a balance between structure and agency. Just one point, the last point, I will not take more time. I think here, John, what we need to consider is, as a way of China's trying to push back, is whether the world will continue to be depending on the dollar. I think the de-dollarization will be the biggest conflict in the future, and I think the U.S. is willing to go to war for that.
Yeah. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you, John, for your point. I also agree with you that it would be interesting to have a Chinese perspective. The last time I was on a panel on a similar conversation, actually. I remember one of the Chinese experts, a colleague of mine, saying that China is not looking to change the international system. Rather, it wants to operate within it, but in the way that it wants to operate within it, not based on the rules of certain powers. But that would be interesting. But to your point about the fuzziness of, the liberal international order and your kind of like a distinction of the two phases of the liberal international order, I think it convinced me further of my point about the liberal international order being in the eyes of the beholder. Because if I take the same argument, the same two phases of pre-1970s and post-1970s. I'm looking at the pre-1970s and I'm thinking about colonization. I'm thinking about decolonization. I'm thinking about the mandate system. I'm thinking about all the assassinations that happened, by, the U.S. and European powers. But at the same time, I'm thinking about Africa's role in contributing to that liberal international order. Its role in the conversation of self-determination within the United Nations, its role in the conversation on human rights, its role and its contribution to the responsibility to protect as a norm within the United Nations. And then, we talk about the post, 1970s, a continuation of, their contribution, but also operating within that international order, but creating alternatives that they know that would be a lot more beneficial to their people. And that's what led to a term we use a lot now in the African Union, which is, African solutions to African problems. So I'm also curious to take that same first phase and second phase and ask, a CARICOM community scholar or an ASEAN scholar or a Chinese scholar for that matter. I'll be curious to see how, it differs when several, people who look at it from different regional perspectives make a distinction of these two phases. And thank you. I didn't get your name, but thank you very much for the question about the islands. Yes, there are still islands in the hands of former colonial powers. The way that the African Union has approached a lot of these matters is based on kind of like decisions within the country of people. You said you're Moroccan, so if I start with the Western Sahara, for instance, the African Union has identified it as a member state, the 55 member states of the African Union, because they look at it not as a process of decolonization, but one of, actually, it's a process of decolonization because, at first it was in the hands of Spain and then later on in the hands of Morocco and, the majority of the people there. Exactly. So they try to make that legal distinction of first, is this, state building exercise one of decolonization or one of, and this is, I'm giving the instance of Somaliland, for instance, of one of secession. And they don't want to set a precedence where, other parts of, Africa, we can context the, the conclusion of leaving colonial borders. But I understand where that sentiment came from when it comes to the African Union. And that's why it's refused to, recognize that. So, and then when we talk about these other islands being held by colonial powers, a lot of this is from referendum of people wanting to remain there. I know that what happened in Mayotte, for instance, kick-started the conversation again. Should we, become our own nation and remove ourselves from, France? As one of the kind of like, I've forgotten the term that they usually use for these islands now. And then we talk about the Chagos Island, for instance. So, another contract has been signed for another 99 years. So, in as much as the African Union or the OAU was created to decolonize these, these spaces, their hands are also tied when you have states signing off 99-year contracts to former colonial powers. But there are important conversations to be had. And I think those conversations are happening considering the relationship to former colonial powers. And I just wanted to hop onto your point about, the Arab world and why it almost seems like it's slow to react to the challenges that it's facing here. And and when I look at being someone who's lived here for only 4 years and observing what's happening, I almost wish that, the spirit of Pan-Arabism could be challenged. And I know it's, it's a difficult conversation, but I hope it could be challenged some way to deal with some of these issues, because if we look at the African context, the reason apartheid ended was because of that spirit of Pan-Africanism. My father was telling me stories of the fact that you made contributions when you were in high school to the ANC movement, and that contribution was happening in East Africa, in Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Tanzania. Thabo Mbeki lived in Nigeria for a while when he was running away from being, killed in South Africa. So, the continent was able to use that movement for, something beneficial to the people of South Africa. And I hope and wish that something similar could happen in this space as well. I want to answer okay, sorry. And then thank you for your question on China and dependency when it comes to the African Union. A lot of people look at China and Africa almost as though they are new to the space, and now we have to be afraid of this 21st century colonial rule that is about to happen, forgetting that China has always been there. It's always Julius Nyerere of Tanzania was interacting with Mao Zedong all the way in post-independence era. China has always been in Africa. They didn't just arrive. So that interaction has been ongoing for a long time. If we even go further in terms of trade, there are historians who have clearly shown trade routes starting all the way in the 12th century. So China is not new to Africa. But I agree with you that what we need to be careful about is how they are interacting with us. The fact that airports are being now under the control of China, mines are being under the control of China, that is something we need to be careful about. Although the African Union is happy about the possibility of forum shopping across actors, they are also aware that it's a problem. What's happening in Kenya, in Zambia, with mines being taken over and airports being taken over is something that we need to be careful about. And unfortunately, in the context of Africa, a lot of institutions have been created to deal with this, this issue of African, solutions to African problems. But it's implementation that we struggle with. In 2021, we created the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's still in the process of implementation. A lot of the member states haven't, implemented, the policies that they're supposed to implement in order to trade with each other. So it's a major problem. We still trade mostly with our former colonial powers than with each other, and that's what these new institutions are trying to change. There was one question, but
you can briefly.
And briefly on your point about regionalism, I think what we see is not just a problem inherent in the liberal system, but I would say it's power politics playing out in the international space. So the EAC, yes, the East African community that you were referring to, broke down before as a result of conflicts among member states, but it was revived, and yet they haven't gotten to the level that we want them to be in, but it's still a regional organization that is there. ECOWAS has been better in terms of creating a better space of free trade and free movement of people, but we see the kind of withdrawal of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and that's also a conversation that we need to talk about. But we could have a conversation later on this. I don't want to take more.
Thank you so much, Marlene, please.
Yeah, maybe on the question of Westernness. I think if you take the West as a geopolitical coalition, it's in the decline, and it was in the decline even before Trump kind of challenging it. I think the US have been reorienting toward their own continent and Asia, and letting kind of Europe dealing with its own space already since at least the Obama period. And then the West as a kind of institutional realities is also in the process of kind of looking out of date. What is driving, I think, it's Westernness as a civilizational identity, right? And the problem with the kind of civilizational identity is that it can be both spatial, like geographic, and ideological. If it's the West as a civilizational unity ideologically, in fact, it's divided, right? Both the American society and European society are divided on their interpretation of what is the West as a civilization. You have those who define the West as liberal, universalistic, as we are used to think of, and then those who think that, no, this civilizational unity is more illiberal, conservative, civilizationist, like particularists with no universalism strategy. So I think both society, the American and the Europeans, are divided in their interpretation of what could be the content of a kind of Western civilization. And then they have the geographical divide to deal with, right? That if the West for the US is mostly the Western hemisphere, it put Europe out. At the same time, if you look at the national security conception, it's very clear. I mean, they have on their part on making Europe great again, a comment about like Europe is strategically and culturally vital for the US, which means they are not cutting the civilizational links with Europe. It's just that they are reorganizing their kind of hardcore military intervention are for the Western Hemisphere, and the kind of ideological interference is for Europe, with the hope of pushing the so-called patriotic forces in Europe, so those who would share this kind of civilizational, illiberal reading kind of in power. For Europe, geographically, if suddenly their Westernness identity is no more connected to the US, they have to reshape from the notion of the West to the notion of a European civilizational identity. And that is complicated to do, because if you are a European civilizational entity, but you cut from the US, so it's no more Western, it's just European, but you are not friends with Russia, so you have a continental divide of your European unity, and then you're not friends with the Muslim world, that looks to me kind of problematic. And I think a lot of European thinkers who try to think in this kind of broad civilizational terms were saying, okay, so if it's no Russia and no more the US, then the only future for this kind of European civilizational entity is to reconcile with the southern part of the Mediterranean. It has to be a Euro-Islam or Euro-Africa type of reconsideration of kind of the relationship to try to deal with the fact that it's not the European continental identity with Russia or the kind of classic Western transatlantic identity with the US. So I think there are a lot of debates on that, but it's really a moment where this notion of Westernness is kind of getting totally transformed, both in terms of content, ideologically, and in terms of its geographical representation.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Excellent questions that, of course, necessitate more roundtable discussions. And I don't want to encroach on people's liberty to go to lunch, so I'll be very, very brief. Let me start with briefly your question on what kind of orders were there. I mean, there are two things. One, describing historical orders. It's a description. And another thing is kind of conceptualization, which the IR field tends to do. You have different schools whose, if you want, ultimate goal is to offer conceptualizations of the international system. It's a rich literature, and I don't have time to go into it. But the post-World War II period is a bipolar world with three normative systems. And each normative system had produced its own institutions. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, then we have a unipolar world led by the US and, broadly speaking, shaped by Western understandings, of which liberal has some traces. I prefer to use traces of liberalism rather than a liberal order for the obvious historical reasons I mentioned. Now, where we're heading, well, it's hybrid in the sense it's a multipolar world. You have Europe, you have the US, you have China, and you have Russia, with varying power structures. But there is a reason to believe that the existing institutions and norms will be reproduced for a major reason I didn't actually mention, but I intended to. There is a difference between this period, or where we're heading to, and the Cold War. Why? It's a common international economy. which makes the idea of hemispheres a bit difficult to apprehend, to be honest, because there is an international economy where China has a stake in and interest in, the US has a stake in, although each wants to calibrate its position within that international economy according to its own interests. But that international economy could offer the ground to keep these international norms alive. So they're not dead. They're not post anything yet, just yet, because even the tools that Trump used are part of his sovereign power, so to speak. Which, I mean, just to address briefly John's points, I agree with Harith's reading on how things are developing. Yes, periodization might be useful, although the building of institutions started literally after 1945 on 3 different levels. The international level, how the US and the Soviet Union managed their relationships. The international levels that belongs to everyone, which translated into the United Nations and the various agreements. But then you had the Warsaw Pact and NATO. So there was more than one normative structure. This is important to bear in mind, in my view. Is the US withdrawing to the Western Hemisphere? Plausible. I don't have a definite answer. I read their national review strategy. There are hints of more that relate to, of course, what is now being fashioned as Trump's transactional approach to international politics. But I didn't see a withdrawal. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the US wants to actually withdraw to the Western Hemisphere. The big question for me is, can it actually withdraw? Even if it decides to, what would happen with Chinese expansion? How would the US reflect on that? Not only Chinese, but also other potential adversaries in the world. I think the US, given its size, has no option but to be part of this broader world. And if you look at the alliances it has been knitting in Asia itself with India, South Korea, of course, traditionally Australia, and Japan, all reflect an attempt to contain, and probably the ultimate goal or wish or desire is to isolate China. Of course, China will fight against these attempts, and then you have all these international dynamics. So I'm a bit suspicious of the idea that the US, even if it intended to withdraw to the Western Hemisphere, whether the big question is whether it can. Is the West the sick man of the world? It's a long discussion. I think the answer Marlene offered on the idea of the West is sufficient. As what it means to the الوطن العربي, بعتقد انه بحاجه نحن لنقاش. هذا بنطلب من المركز العربي يعملوا ماذا تعني هذه التحولات وكيف تترجم في الإقليم. And this is an area I'd be comfortable talking about, of course. بس حرام لازم نعطيها حقها، ما فيني نحكي عنها بسرعة. Just the last point, thank you for excellent points you've raised, which bring to the attention the idea of conceptual history and the role of history. I think the points you make are very strong, but what I had in mind is what sovereignty means now and how it is employed by nationalist movements, whether they're on the right or on the left, because all the movements in the developing world who wanted to counter US hegemony used the principle of sovereignty to buttress their own position, but also to justify their own actions. What Iran is doing now and what Venezuela was doing in the past 2 weeks and what Cuba is doing, they're all emphasizing the idea of sovereignty. And sovereignty in this case is linked to the national state, not the nation state, the national state. And the national state is, of course, is a very modern notion. So there is an argument to make. Now, of course, if you have problems with liberalism, as it is, say, as it has been operating in the US or the UK or the EU, and you belong to MAGA, for instance, you're more inclined to say, I will not let international institutions constrain my power because I'm a sovereign, independent state. That's the central of Trump's arguments, but also the far right in Europe and the Brexit movement in the UK. So sovereignty and nationalism, you could argue, are very well linked. So pretty modern in many ways. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Adham. Thank you all. If I could just wrap up a little bit, how I perceive this seventh round of winter school program. I saw it as a journey of a 6-day journey that took off with reflections and conceptualizations of on liberalism, reflections on liberalism, values, norms, institutions, and today we landed with power politics. So what I gather from the discussion we had today is that there's, of course, a great power competition, and there's uncertainty as to where this competition is leading us to. And there was an agreement on the fact that the world is shifting. Something is shifting underneath our feet and before our eyes, but there was a disagreement on what it is. Is it liberalism? Is it a liberal globalism? Is it the liberal international order? Is it something else? I think we will conclude with the need to live with this uncertainty for a while, and probably and certainly reflect on it, probably for more sessions and who knows, probably a follow-up winter school on this major issue. So with this, I would like to thank you all, thank the participants, all the scholars who really enriched the debate and timely debate. I would like to thank the lecturers with amazing talks that really broadened the discussions and brought new ideas and challenging ideas. I would like to thank in particular on behalf of the Arab Center and behalf of also of the participants, Hani, Awad, who really put together this amazing program, who worked very, very hard to make this an exceptional winter school program, along with his team, Randa Al-Ashhab, Mariam Hawari, and others. I would like to thank our colleagues in the events who also worked hard to make sure that the social program is also wonderful, Mu'taz and his colleagues. They deserve a sound of applause. I would like to thank our colleagues in the sister institution, Doha Institute for Graduate Center, who've always been on our side, contributing to the debate and discussion and pushing forward the limits of the challenges that we are facing. I would like, of course, and our Dr. Abdul Wahab, Professor Abdul Wahab just left us. Dr. Amal is here. So on behalf of the Arab Center and all participants, thank you, big thank you. The major thanks to all the technicians who have been with us, Ibrahim Abdel Jawad behind the booth over there, and the translators, interpreters who also worked hard on this session. Thank you. A major thanks also to those who have been following up the winter school through the social media. We received a great feedback. I think this was a real success. And the number of people who have been following the open discussions has been increasing day by day. So thank you to the followers. And I will not, of course, conclude without giving the floor to our colleague Ani Hawad to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Aicha, and thank you very much, Roundtable 2 speakers. And as we close the 7th International Winter School, I want to thank again all lecturers, discussants, and participants for the seriousness, generosity, and openness that they brought this week. I hope the conversation here will travel with you beyond Doha into your research, teaching, and future collaborations. Thank you for being part of this collective effort and for making this edition of the Winter School intellectually rigorous and genuinely collegial. I would not repeat, of course, all names, just Dr. Aicha mentioned, but I would also include Yara and Muhammad Assaf, who also joined us to help. I would like also to thank the audio team, Amal, Ibrahim Abdel Jawad, Maqsood, and also Mahfouz, who is always here. A special thanks also to Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Afandi, who supported us before the program and during the program, to Dr. Amal Ghazal and Dr. Muhammad Al-Masri, of course, for his support, and our colleagues in the social media, Mahmoud Mtawi and Abdul Men'am and Faisal from the design, Suhail, and of course Mu'taz and Omar Khalid, who engineered the social program. And finally, I owe my small team, Mariam Hani and Randall Ashab, with whom I was fighting all the time during this year. I would like to say thank you, and I would like to say sorry. I still hope that that Rand is my friend, but I don't know. I don't know what to say actually. Okay. So thank you very much. Lunch is served in the next building, the building where the first lecture took place, and we'll see all participants, and of course all of you are invited to lunch, and we'll see you also on the goodbye dinner tonight. Thank you very much.